historical organization in Hooksett, and just to be able to tell you some information about Manchester's history, and specifically the history of what is probably, arguably, one of the most important companies in the history of the state of New Hampshire. It's a company that really shaped and built the city of Manchester and had a lot of impact on the surrounding communities as well. That, of course, is the Amoskeag Manufacturing Company. The Manchester, as we know it today, is really a product of the American Industrial Revolution. The city's creation and growth are largely the legacy of this one entity, the Amoskeag Manufacturing Company. The Amoskeag was incorporated in 1831 and was operated for more than a century, closing its doors finally in 1935. The company's owners were known as the Boston Associates. They developed textile manufacturing systems previously in Waltham and Lowell, Massachusetts, before traveling up the Merrimack River to Manchester. Here they acquired the water power rights to the swift-flowing Amoskeag Falls, and they purchased about 15,000 acres of land from Manchester farmers on the east side of the river. These very shrewd moves enabled the company to control the future shape of the mill yard and also shape the growth of the city that would support its industrial operation. And so the company's red brick mile of mills, that, as it was referred to, that stretches along the east side of the Merrimack River, still today anchors the city firmly to its industrial past. So tonight I hope to give you an understanding of the Amoskeag's origins, how it developed, and its lasting legacy in the region. To begin, really, we begin with a history of how the Industrial Revolution came to be. In the early days of our country, cloth was made by hand. The cloth could be made of cotton, which needed to be transported from southern lands, or from sheep's wool. And this is a picture of a typical yarn winder. The Scots-Irish settlers who came to the region of Londonderry, what became Manchester, Manchester was originally called Derryfield, they started arriving in this area around 1720, and they brought with them seeds of the flax plant that you see here. And along with that, they brought the skills to grow and produce flax fibers that were then spun and woven into linen. During this period, the making of clothes and other textiles for use in the home was a very labor-intensive process. The fabrics you could make were simple and coarse. If you had enough money, you could buy better, fancier cloth that was normally imported from Europe. But a typical person really could only afford to have 2 or maybe 3 changes of clothing unless they were very wealthy. By the mid-18th century, inventors in England were experimenting with technology to automate textile manufacturing. In 1769, a man named Richard Arkwright patented new machinery that could card and spin cotton and could be operated by water power. The great advantage with his machines is that they could maintain a continuous flow of materials through the process, basically maximizing the output that it could produce. He set up a mill in the county of Derbyshire in central England, and this was the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. This is an image of Arkwright's water frame. A man named Samuel Slater was born in Derbyshire at about this time that Arkwright was patenting his machinery, and began working in the textile industry at the age of 14. He learned about the new technology, both how to build it and how to operate the machinery. Americans at this time were also experimenting with automated textile manufacturing, bringing some technology from England. And after the American Revolution, the United States government actually encouraged such enterprises, and there were some successes, but the machinery that was developed in the United States was too inefficient to be run by water power, so it was very slow going. And to complicate things, England prohibited the exportation of machinery and machinery plans out of England, so that presented a problem for the Americans as well. But Samuel Slater saw that there was opportunity in America, and so in 1789 he traveled to the United States. While on board ship, he actually dressed as a farmer to avoid any suspicions that he was really a mechanic who was taking the knowledge of textile production out of England to sell to the Americans. But that is what he did. After a stay in New York, he was hired by a textile firm of Almy and Brown in Pawtucket, Rhode Island. Slater rebuilt and improved cotton preparation and spinning machines, and that he would prove important to sparking the Industrial Revolution in America. not only because of the improvements in technology that he introduced, but also because he knew how to manage a textile operation, how to operate the machinery most effectively and efficiently to produce as much cloth as possible for sale to drive the business, basically not waiting until orders came in. This system would become known as the Slater system. This is a drawing of the Slater Mill at Pawtucket Falls in the background, and the White Mill, which is also operated by Slater. These two buildings still exist today. They are part of the Slater Mill historic site. And Samuel Slater's ideas began to take hold in New England, and small mill complexes following the Slater system began to spring up at water power sites around New England. And one of the premier water power sites that attracted attention was the Amoskeag Falls on the Merrimack River in Manchester. Here you see the Amoskeag Falls and the fishing islands that were right below the falls. This area of waterfall and rapids on the Merrimack stretched for about half a mile above and around the fishing islands where Native Americans had fished for thousands of years. There was a 54-foot drop in the river at the falls. That 54-foot drop is very important because it provided tremendous water power potential. In the 18th and early 19th centuries, people took advantage of this water power by building sawmills and grist mills at the falls. And then in 1809, 1810, a man named Benjamin Pritchard started a small water-powered cotton spinning operation on the west side of the river with local financing. This was located at the head of the Amoskeag Falls, which at that time was part of the town of Goffstown. Eventually, this company was reorganized under the ownership of 6 investors from the Boston area and Rhode Island, one of whom was famous Samuel Slater. At first, the company, which was called the Amoskeag Cotton and Woolen Manufacturing Company, just spun the yarn, which was then taken in bundles on horseback to local farms to be woven by hand. Then in 1819, the first power looms in the region began operating here, so that the entire operation, from the raw cotton to the textiles, could be done on site. This operation grew into a little town called the Amoskeag Village. The town had housing for the manager and workers, place for worship, and the first post office on the west side of the river. The company also operated eventually 3 small mills like this one. This one was known as the Bell Mill. It's the only image of the 3 mills that we have. And at its height, the company employed around 60 people. By the 1820s, the company had become pretty well known for its ticking, which is this striped fabric that was often used on mattresses and pillows. Meanwhile, some wealthy families from the Boston area who had originally made their fortunes in shipping were looking for a longer-term and less risky investment. They decided that textiles were the way to go. Among these were the Lowells, the Jacksons, the Appletons, the Coolidges, the Amorys, the Cabots. These were the families that would endow Harvard College, the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, and other prominent institutions in Massachusetts. Francis Cabot Lowell had traveled to England and studied the British machinery, which was superior to anything that had been developed at the time in America. Because it was forbidden to take machine plans out of England, he brought the designs back, the ideas back in his head, and succeeded in building the first working power loom in America. This led to the creation of a textile operation at Waltham, Massachusetts, which was known as the Boston Manufacturing Company, which would be much larger in scale than anything Samuel Slater had dreamed of. So the Boston Associates developed a textile producing system whereby all of the steps needed to produce cloth, from the carding of the raw wool, to the spinning, to the dyeing the yarn, to weaving, could all be done under one roof. This led to much greater production and improved profitability for the textile industry. And these investors soon turned their attention to the Merrimack River and its tremendous water power potential. Starting in 1821, they began to develop East Chelmsford on the Pawtucket Falls, which later became Lowell. The Boston Associates were familiar also with the factory operations that were going on at the Amoskeag Village, and were very impressed by the water power potential at Amoskeag Falls, which far exceeded that of the Pawtucket Falls at Lowell. So in 1831, They bought out the original investors of the company in Amoskeag Village, and they incorporated the company as the Amoskeag Manufacturing Company. So now the Boston Associates owned this small mill operation on the west side of Amoskeag Falls. This included about 1,500 acres of land, and since their plan was to build a large-scale operation based on what they had done elsewhere in Waltham and in Lowell, they sent their engineers up to survey how best to proceed. The engineers decided that the east side of the Merrimack River would be best for development. The shoreline was straighter, the land was flatter, so the company bought up a transportation canal that existed on the east side. And they also bought up as much land as they could from about 15 local families. The company ended up with over 15,000 acres of land on the east side of the river. This enabled the Amoskeag Manufacturing Company not only to control the development of the large textile plant that they were planning, but also the development of the city to support the textile operation. This is a map of the Amoskeag Company's holdings in 1840. You still see over here, this was the original Amoskeag Village, and the mills here, which are still in operation in 1840. There's this, the transportation canal labeled Lodgett's Canal here that they bought. You can see over here the first large-scale mills that were being built, known as the Stark Mills. And all this land up here is starting to be developed into a city. And you see the streets being laid out, Elm Street, Canal Street. This was all land owned by Amoskeag, so they had control over how the city developed. We're going to talk more about that part in a few minutes, but I wanted to go back to the canal, the Lodgett's Canal. The company bought this, it was a transportation canal, and they continued to operate it for transportation purposes for several years. The canal had been built by Samuel Blodgett. It was completed in 1807, and it was a transportation canal basically so that riverboats could bypass the Amoskeag Falls and continue down south of the Amoskeag Falls. Samuel Blodgett had a dream that Derryfield, that was the name of the town, could become like the Manchester of America. He had visited the industrial city of Manchester, England, and really saw a lot of potential that Derryfield could become like Manchester. After his death, the town people of Derryfield decided to rename the town Manchester in his honor. This was in 1810, so really before any substantial industrialization had taken place. There were actually only 113 taxpayers in the town at that time. But that's how Manchester got its name. And so this canal and other canals along the Merrimack River were important to the company in its early years. They could transport building materials to build buildings. They could transport cotton and other materials for production, and they could export. They could transport finished products to the market using the canal. By the 1840s, the use of canals was becoming obsolete with the railroad. But by law, the company had to maintain the canal as a transportation canal into the 1850s. After they were no longer required to operate as a transportation canal, it was incorporated as part of the lower canal, which is there were two canals that Amoskeag had. This is the lower canal is the one on the left. It was basically widened, lined with granite, and lengthened to the end of the mill yard. And it became about 1 1/3 mile long. To power the mills, the Amoskeag Manufacturing Company used these two canals, the upper canal and the lower canal, which diverted the water and the water power generated by the 54-foot drop in the Amoskeag Falls into the mill yard. That generated about 16,000 horsepower potential. Through the canals, the water would go through the canals into penstocks that were piped into the mills, which in turn would move the turbines and to run the pulleys, shafts, belts, and gears to run the equipment. So just as a comparison, to compare Manchester with Lowell, Lowell had a 33-foot drop at the Pawtucket Falls compared to a 54-foot. So they only had about 10,000 horsepower potential. So the Amoskeag Millyard would eventually really far surpass the operations in Lowell. Construction of the mill yard, as you see, it's starting here, they're building material here. It took place over about an 80-year period. Eventually there would be 30 major factory buildings, plus many smaller buildings, storehouses, picker houses, warehouses, dye houses, counting houses, bleach houses, and other smaller buildings, equaling about 8 million square feet of floor space. There was over a mile of mills on the east side of the river, and then 2 mill complexes on the west side of the river as well. Now we'll talk about materials that they used to build these mills. Most important material, bricks, came from Hooksett. They came from company-owned brickyards here in Hooksett. The granite wood came from various places, but a lot of it came from the Ledge, which is now above Derryfield Park in Manchester. Glass was imported from Chelmsford. They also used wood and iron that was forged and shaped in the company's own machine shop and foundry. This is a drawing of the Stark Mills. This was the first mill to be completed and put into operation in 1838. These were the mills that you saw on that map a few slides ago. The Stark Mills was a company that contracted with the Amoskeag Manufacturing Company for its buildings and its water power, but operated under separate ownership until the early 20th century. There were several companies that operated like this, in addition to the Amoskeag Manufacturing Company, which had its own mill operations. But by the 1920s, everything had been consolidated under one ownership of the Amoskeag Manufacturing Company, which would be important at the end of the Amoskeag's story because it went out of business, they went bankrupt, and so that meant the entire mill yard was now shut down. The Stark Mills were the first mills to employ mill girls, who were referred to as mill girls, young women who came from farms in the region. They were sort of the first workforce in the mills. And immigrants were already coming in by this point as well. The Irish in particular came to Manchester and helped to build the canals, the mill buildings, and the workers' housing. Those of you familiar with the mill yard know this statue. This is the famous mill girl statue. It's on the back side of the Stark Mill building. And she represents the early mill girls who worked in this building, but also the thousands of women who worked in the mill yard over the years. The statue was created by the artist Antoinette Schultz and was dedicated in 1988. The mill yard would take shape as a cohesive campus that was surrounded by gates. There were bridges going over the canals. There were overhead walkways from building to building. The railroad was built in, as you can see, and running along the east side, there were railroad spurs that entered the mill yard so that cars could load and unload at the different mill buildings. I'm just going to show you a few early drawings of various parts of the mill yard. This is the upper yard. And here's a view of the mill yard taken from the west side of the river. And this is the part of the mill yard that was operated by the Manchester Mills. Again, sort of like the Stark Mills, this was originally a separate entity that eventually got consolidated and absorbed by Amoskeag. In addition to building the mills, the Amoskeag Company also built housing for their workers. So you can see these brick row houses here, and there's rows and rows of houses as it goes up the hill towards Elm Street. These workers' housing buildings mostly are still in Manchester today, being used as apartments, condos, and some offices. So the Amoskeag Company, as I mentioned before, had bought up about 15,000 acres of land. It used about 700 of those acres for its mill yard, and it set the wheels in motion for a city to grow up and to support the factory complex. So simultaneously with its development of the mill yard and the worker housing district, the Amoskeag laid out the city's streets on a neat grid system. They would run north, south, east, and west, and they disposed of over 14,000 plus surplus acres through a series of land sales that were held between 1838 and 1845. The company gave parkland to the city. So Concord Square that you see, that's a parkland that was given to the city specifically for open space, never to be built upon. They gave certain pieces of land to the city for schools to be built. They gave certain parcels of land to churches for them to build church buildings. They really had a vision for how they wanted the city of Manchester's look. And they literally built the city of Manchester and determined how it was going to be laid out. The job of laying out the land in the central portion of town fell to this man who was hired as a 19-year-old, Ezekiel Straw. He was originally from Lowell, Mass, and he was hired and was responsible for designing the layout of the city. And the result was Manchester, which is the largest planned city in New England. And really a true success story of early urban planning in America. Just to give you an idea of how rapidly the city grew, in 1838 there were only about 50 people living in the area. By 1846, which is when Manchester was incorporated as a city, there were just over 10,000. 1860, it had doubled to over 20,000. By 1900, there were 57,000. In 1923, which is really considered the height of the Amoskeag Manufacturing Company's success, there were 80,000 people. Ezekiel Straw went on to have a 40-year career with the company, rising up through the ranks until he was put in charge of all of the power operations of the company, and eventually became its agent, which was the highest-ranking local official who essentially ran all of the operations of the company. He also served in terms as governor of New Hampshire, and both his son and grandson would go on to become agents of the company as well. This is an image of the Union Block, which was built in 1841, the first brick business to be built on Elm Street in Manchester. Today it's the site of the City Hall Plaza building. And this is an image of Elm Street, laid out, again, by Ezekiel Straw as the main thoroughfare of Manchester. And Monument Square, one of the parklands that was set aside by Amoskeag for the city and its residents to enjoy. This is now known as Veterans Park, where the Civil War monument is, right off of Elm Street. As I said before, the city grew rapidly. And although the Amoskeag Manufacturing Company remained the major employer for its entire existence, there were many other types of businesses that sprung up in Manchester, including shoe manufacturing, cigar making, harness makers. There were grocery stores, department stores, insurance companies, and banks that sprung up to provide additional employment. There were also, of course, doctors, dentists, dressmakers, printers, theaters, and restaurants, basically everything a good-sized city needed to sustain itself. And the Amoskeag Manufacturing Company and other textile operations in the Amoskeag Millyard really made a huge impact in cloth production in New England. They produce a wide range of textiles, mostly cotton. There are also some wool and linen operations. Gingham was the most popular, most commonly produced textile, but denim, ticking, muslin, duck, all sorts of other types of fabric were produced in the mills. And at its height in 1912, the company made 5 million yards of cloth per week. That translates to 150,000 miles of cloth a year, and that's basically 400 miles of cloth produced each day. This image that you see here is 1 day's worth of product that was produced by the Amoskeag Manufacturing Company. They decided they wanted to basically promote what they could produce, and so they put it all in one room. Pretty remarkable amount of textiles that could be made in 1 day at Amoskeag. In addition to textiles, though, there were some other materials produced by the Amoskeag Manufacturing Company through its machine shop. Ezekiel Straw, in particular, had a very big interest in advancing the company's machine shop operations, basically seeing a potential for more income but also potential to really help promote the name of Amoskeag. So the Amoskeag Company employed machinists and other metal workers to make and repair the machinery in the mill yard. That was the primary function of the machine shop, to make the company self-sufficient. They would also make fencing, fire hydrants, light fixtures, railing posts, and gates for the mill yard. Here's some machinists that worked for Amoskeag. Like I said, the idea was that Amoskeag would be self-sufficient, not reliant on other outside companies or contractors to supply and repair their machines. But in addition to the basic work, the machine shop developed some initiatives that helped to increase revenue and raise awareness of the name of Amoskeag. The first of these was the production of locomotives. Steam locomotives were produced by the machine shop for about a decade, beginning in 1849 and ending in 1859. And Amoskeag produced 232 engines that were sold to various railroads throughout the country. This was right at the height of, as railroads were expanding across the country. Like I said, they ended production in 1859, but sold their operations to the Manchester Locomotive Works, which continued to operate in Manchester and produce these locomotives. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Mount Washington Cogs Railway, the old engines with the steam engines, a lot of those were produced by the Manchester Locomotive Works. Here's another steam locomotive produced by Amoskeag. And another type of machine produced by the machine shop was the Amoskeag steam fire engine. The story of the Amoskeag engines really begins with their inventor, who was Nehemiah Bean. Nehemiah Bean got his start at Lowell in Lawrence, Massachusetts, where he became an expert machinist and woodworker. In 1847, he came to Manchester and began working for the Amoskeag. His first job was as an overseer of the pattern room at the Amoskeag machine shop. And from 1850 to 1854, he was the superintendent of the locomotive department, producing the locomotives. But in 1854, he left Manchester, and for the next 5 years worked in Lawrence for the Amoskeag Manufacturing Company. While there, he became interested in steam fire engines, which were beginning to become popular in the United States around this time. So with a fellow worker in Lawrence named Thomas Scott, he built a 4-ton steam fire engine called the Lawrence. This was the first fire engine that was the first steam fire engine ever produced in New England, which is really a remarkable feat considering that neither man had ever seen a steam fire engine before. They had just read about them. They tested the engine in Lawrence at the end of June of 1858, and through their testing gradually increased the steam and water pressure to see what the engine could do. They had a few burst fire hoses, but eventually the machine was able to shoot water 198 feet into the air through 135 feet of hose. So shortly after that same year, Nehemiah Bean was convinced, Ezekiel Straw saw what he was up to and convinced him to return to Manchester, and because Mr. Straw really saw great potential with the production of steam fire engines in the machine shop. So Bean he agreed. They made him an offer, and he returned to Amoskeag, was put in charge of building and designing steam fire engines. That year he built the first Amoskeag steam fire engine ever constructed, called the Amoskeag No. 1, which you see here. The engine was tested on July 4th, 1859. Within 7 minutes, it easily shot 2 streams of water to a vertical height of 203 feet. So a big improvement over his original invention, the Lawrence. The city of Manchester was so impressed by this that they bought the engine and they established Steam Fire Engine Company No. 1. Here's another drawing of the Amoskeag engines. Bean took out 6 patents on his inventions related to steam fire engine construction. Within a short time, the manufacturing of steam fire engines and hose carriages became the major focus of the machine shop. For the next 20 years, the company manufactured these steam fire engines under Bean's supervision. Mechanics were hired to meet increased demand, and soon an engine could be built within 2 months of the receipt of an order. Over the next decades, 550 Amoskeag engines were built, and they became famous and popular throughout the country. Just sort of like the locomotives were purchased by railroads, Fire departments bought these from all around the country. New York City's fire department ordered a whole fleet of them. Some were even sold outside of the United States to countries including Canada, Russia, China, Australia, Peru, and Chile. This engine is the Ashland #1 that was made for the town of Ashland, Massachusetts. And I'm putting some because pretty exciting. The Manchester Historic Association Museum, the Millyard Museum, acquired this not too long ago, and just recently, back in August, brought it into the museum as part of our exhibit. So we now have the Amoskeag steam fire engine on display. The machine shop also produced the Amoskeag rifles during the Civil War. They produced 27,000 special model 1861 contract rifle muskets. They were based on the standard Springfield model, and around 7,000 carbine rifles between 1863 and 1865. Part of the reason for producing these rifles, obviously the supply of cotton was severely limited during the Civil War. South was not shipping us their cotton for understandable reasons. So as a means for continuing production and keeping their workers employed, they contracted with the United States government to produce these rifles for the Union Army. And during the Civil War, 300 men were employed to produce these rifles, and they produced 125 guns each day. So, who worked for the Amoskeag Manufacturing Company? The earliest workers were men and women from farms in the area, the mill girls. A lot of the early construction was done by Irish immigrants, who I mentioned before. They soon began working in the mills as well. The French Canadians began coming in large numbers, and many other nationalities were eventually represented in the factories, including Germans, Russians, English, Scots, Greeks, Poles, Lithuanians, and many more. In the early 20th century, there was over 17,000 workers employed in the mill yard. And interestingly, almost evenly split, about 8,000 were men and 7,000 were women. A lot of people ask how long a typical workday was for the workers of the Amoskeag mills. Before 1849, they would work 6 12-and-a-half-hour days. They had Sundays off, but would work from 6:30 in the morning to 7:30 at night, with about a 35-minute lunch at noon time. Gradually over time, these hours were reduced. By 1899, they would work 5 10-and-a-half-hour days, as well as a half day on Saturday. And the rest of Saturday and Sunday they had off. In 1914, a 55-hour work week was the norm. Just have some images of some of the workers in the mills. These are some men who were cloth inspectors. This image is of Swedish immigrants who served as weavers in the mills. Some boys sweeping in the spinning room. And a group of women who worked in the mills. Child labor was common. These are young girls who worked for the Amoskeag. There was also an interesting group that was formed by the Amoskeag Company called the Amoskeag Textile Club. Basically, the Amoskeag Company, it had a program of corporate paternalism. They would provide assistance and benefits to their employees and to the city as a whole. This was done really as a way to develop a very stable and a relatively happy workforce. That would mean less labor unrest for them and smoother operations in general. For example, the company would sponsor clubs and sports teams. They developed Textile Field, which we now know today as Gill Stadium. They also sold land to employees on the west side of Manchester at very favorable rates that would enable many families to own their own property. This is a baseball club team that was formed by the Amoskeag Textile Club. This club sponsored activities for employees. In addition to sports teams, they would provide theatrical performances and an annual textile club fair. that featured various exhibits where participants showcased a variety of animals and plants, including fish, livestock, poultry, flowers, and fruits and vegetables. So what happened to the Amoskeag Manufacturing Company, this great company? World War I gave the company a big boost for a short time, and things looked good. But competition from newer, more efficient southern mills really began to take a toll on all of New England. They had cheaper labor down there. It was really too much for all of the textile manufacturers of New England. The company was running on antiquated equipment that it was difficult to replace. And their biggest product was gingham, which by the 1920s had begun to go out of stock. So sales were down. Unions were not really very successful here in Manchester. There was a strike organized by the Knights of Labor in 1885. That was really about it until the 1920s. The United Textile Workers came in 1917. There was never a closed shop. Workers were never allowed to collect union dues in the workrooms. But in February of 1922, the company announced an increase in hours with a 20% decrease in pay. Obviously, not making their workers happy. This was really being done in New England, all over New England, by mill owners. And there were strikes all over. Manchester was not an exception. There was a strike in Manchester that year that lasted for about 9 months. And here's a parade of strikers in 1922. Unfortunately for the employees, they really didn't gain anything from their actions. The workers who went on strike, if they were identified, could not return to work. And in 1925, the Amoskeag Manufacturing Company was reorganized. The cash assets were transferred to a new holding company based in Boston called the Amoskeag Company. Things continued to get worse for the company, and eventually, in 1935, they essentially shut down their operations and filed for bankruptcy in December, hoping to be able to reorganize.